Welcome back to the Rodman Word, and we are continuing on with the life of Solomon. But today we are really going to look at more examples of his wisdom, and then also how he responds or how he is being blessed by the Lord because of that wisdom. Turn to First Kings chapter 4. We're going to finish off the chapter here. So we're going to look at verses 20 through 34. So 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served King Solomon all the days of his life. So not only is Solomon being well known in his own country, but he's also being well known in these other countries as well. The they that's mentioned at the end of verse 21 there, when it says they brought tribute, I think it's not just the Israelites, but I think it's the Philistines and the Egyptians in verse 21 that are being referenced there. So Solomon, being a believer in the Lord, through his gift of wisdom that the Lord has given him, is proclaiming the glory of the Lord. Well, you and I, as believers, can do very much do the same thing with our spiritual gifts as well. Now, don't get me wrong; spiritual gifts are very much for the local church, for your local church body to edify and to encourage each other. But there is also a very evangelistic tool that our spiritual gifts have. It shows unbelievers, hey, the Lord has done this for me, and I would love for you to get a chance to spend some time with the Lord, get to know Him. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in just the first couple verses. But verse 22, Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal. So when we're looking at cores there, or cors, um, that's about 6 bushels or 220 liters, and that's just for one core. So if you multiply that by 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, my goodness. And that's just for one day. But it continues on, verse 23. 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. Basically, this guy is pulling in quite a bit. He is a lack for nothing, which we will see later on in verse 27. Verse 24, for he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates River, from Tiphsah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates River, and he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of King Solomon. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for the horses and swift steeds they brought to the place, where it was required, each according to his duty. So here you really see a couple things. One, a big part of the wisdom of Solomon is to find he's much more of a diplomat than his father King David was. His father King David was much more of a foundation builder and a conqueror, whereas Solomon is more of a building on that foundation and a diplomat. And I think that's kind of why we see there is more peace in the land during the reign of King Solomon. Now, granted, at the end of his reign, that is not entirely so, and especially knowing that the son of Solomon King Rehoboam is the one who gets into a tussle with Jeroboam, and that leads to the split of Israel into the northern part and the southern part. So that will soon end, sadly, but for now, there's a lot of peace. And a big part of that isn't just the wisdom of Solomon, but the military prowess or the things that he has inherited, the military things that he has inherited. There is really, as verse 27, the end of it says, there is really nothing that he is lacking. It is interesting because if you go into Deuteronomy, God does warn about having too many chariots, too many horses, too much wealth. And the reason why is because that will start to turn the heart of that individual king and make them greedy. Well, for Solomon, we will see that eventually, but not necessarily with wealth, but with women. So we will see that later on. We'll get to that later on. But here, let's finish off. Verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. There you go. So that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish, and people of all countries came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So this is quite the statement here in this last section here. The wisdom, or again, the spiritual gifts that God gives us can be used for evangelistic purposes. It's very possible that these nations that are coming to get advice from Solomon most likely have never heard of Jehovah, have never heard of the Lord. And so he has this opportunity to teach them about the Lord. And he does that not just through his advice that he gives, but through his writing as well, as we see in verse 32. And at the end of walking through the life of Solomon here in First Kings, we will take a look at the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and take a snapshot of the wisdom that he gives in his writings, because that is a very big avenue that he uses. But for me, I think the main part of this section of the end of chapter 4 is that Solomon does not hold his spiritual gift of wisdom to himself. He doesn't just use it for his own gain, but he uses it to better the lives of others, to encourage them, to advise them, to help them. And that's how you and I, as followers of Jesus, should use our own spiritual gifts. Yes, don't get me wrong, they do help us as believers. But they are also meant to encourage other believers, to help in a way to bring unbelievers to the cross of Christ. Spiritual gifts don't save anybody. They never will. But they do help give a glimpse of what the Christian life is like. And the gifts that God gives to those that follow and trust in his Son, and that is the only way that they can receive those gifts, is if they do put their faith and trust in Jesus. So with that being said, that is where we will end today. Next week we will talk, or sorry, on Thursday, we'll talk a little bit about the temple itself. We won't go through the whole entire thing because it is very long. But there is some things that we can take from the building of the temple to the consecration of it. And so we will look at the temple on Thursday. But thanks for spending some time here today with me in the Brownman Word. Thanks.